Well, I think all sensible people have the British Constitution as one of their hobbies. It is the most interesting matter to discuss and be informed about. As Dicey argued, it is Parliament that is the defender of the liberties of the people, of our ancient Constitution and of our freedoms. I give way. Hello, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. Delighted to be with you once again to spend time talking about something very dear to my heart, the Constitution of this United Kingdom. In each episode, I'm talking to some of the most sagacious specialists and eminent experts on the subject of our constitutional democracy, with a view to exploring the role of Parliament at its heart. In this episode, I hope to examine Parliament's legislating function in a way which builds on my discussions so far. Here is first Professor Vernon Bogdanor, and then Natasha Engel, the former MP and Deputy Speaker, on the role of MPs in linking up those they represent with the executive during the lawmaking process.
Many constituents, perhaps most constituents, they have interests which aren't necessarily those of the grand themes of party debate. For instance, if you're a small farmer or a small businessman, you may be interested in quite technical details about how legislation might affect your farm or your business. And it's for the MPs to raise it.
The understanding that the problems are the same, whether you're in Somerset or you're in North East Derbyshire, people have similar problems. It's how we deal with those, and actually coming together as a parliament and lots of different MPs from lots of different backgrounds is much better at solving those problems than if you're doing it by yourself.
I'm very grateful to both Natasha Engel and Vernon Bogdanor for their views, and I do encourage you to listen to the full-length director's cut version of my interviews with them. For now, though, in this episode, I'm joined by Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth, who is Professor of Government and Director of the Centre for Legislative Studies at the University of Hull. Hello, Professor, and thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
I wondered if I could start by thanking you, which I don't think I've ever done properly, for sending me as an intern many years ago, Deanna Davison, who has gone on to be a very successful politician and Member of Parliament. That makes me feel very old, having an intern who has become an MP. But as an aside, before we start our conversation, thank you, because you've educated so many important political figures. But I wondered if we could start this discussion by considering the development of lawmaking in the UK in recent centuries. How did legislation come about in the way that it's come about?
Well, it's developed over time from the initial inception of the development of Parliament. As you know, there was no one point at which we can say Parliament suddenly came into being. It developed from the King's Court, and as a response to the King making demands of initially lords and prelates, and then obviously expanding it to the knights and burgesses drawn from the counties and then the boroughs, really to give assent to the King's demands for money, and then out of that developed demands for legislation. The court was there to advise the king, but increasingly the development of law became a task shared with Parliament, and Parliament took over the writing of statutes from the king. So it really all developed from that. So really the relationship was one where the king made demands, and that is still fundamental to our constitution. The crown makes demands to which Parliament responds, and that I think is absolutely crucial. But over time, Parliament has become more significant and developed how it responds to those demands. And particularly, I think, fundamental and certainly still at the core of our constitution was the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights of 1689. Because what that established was that the Crown could not legislate without the assent of Parliament. So the king could no longer legislate, get round Parliament. He had to go through Parliament. And that is core to understanding the significance of the institution. Parliament is not so much a law-making body, because the laws are drawn up essentially within the executive and brought before Parliament. Parliament is fundamental because it is a law-assenting body. Without the assent of Parliament, you do not have acts of Parliament. They cannot be enforced. So it's the fact that the executive, the Crown, has to go through Parliament to get its measures is absolutely fundamental.
And the Bill of Rights removes the dispensing and suspensing power, doesn't it? So up until then, it was thought that the king could either get rid of a law that was inconvenient or take individuals out of the law because that suited his purpose. And from 1688-89 onwards, it's clear that the law affects everybody equally, and there is no ability for it to be taken away in specific circumstances. And that remains very important because actually governments would still to this day find it quite convenient to suspend laws from time to time.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes Parliament absolutely fundamental. There are some systems where the executive can still legislate by decree and so get round the legislature. Now, since 1689, the Crown has not been able to do that. As you indicate, before that, it could. So the monarch could exist for quite a long time without ever summoning a parliament. But from 1689 onwards, Parliament's been core to the lawmaking process. And that's what makes it important as an institution. Government cannot get around Parliament. It has to go through Parliament. And that's what makes Parliament so fundamental to our constitutional system.
And we have no real equivalent to the sort of executive orders that they have in the United States, that there's almost no form of law, whether it's negative or affirmative statutory instruments, that don't have to come through Parliament at some point in their progress.
If it's to have legal force, there's still prerogative powers that can be deployed. The key point is now you can override it with the use of statute. So that displaces the prerogative. So the prerogative's still there unless Parliament has legislated to the contrary.
Yes. And the way we legislate, obviously that has changed enormously. It always amuses me that if you look in the division lobby, the first volume of Acts covers several hundred years, and then the latest volume of Acts covers about 6 months. That the volume and the quantity of legislation and the wordiness of legislation has increased enormously. Do you know why that is?
I think it's primarily, and you're quite right, and you're right to stress the word volume. It's not necessarily the length of acts, because they're not necessarily longer. It's the sheer number, it's the combination, the acts themselves. Sorry, it's not the number of acts, it's the length of acts, the volume of legislation. And as I think you were touching upon, it's not just a quantitative aspect, it's a qualitative one. The legislation is more complex in its detail. So it makes demands of Parliament because it requires more time to get through all the legislation and indeed to make sense of it. And I think it's a response to the nature of government itself in relation to society. Obviously, with the growth of a mass electorate, more demands are made of government. And particularly in the 20th century, the growth of the welfare state, the reach of government has become far more extensive. And as a consequence, you get more legislation, the need within that for the complexity of society as well, the greater need for regulation. So a lot of measures are regulatory. They provide obviously for secondary legislation. So that has expanded over time. And of course, it's put tremendous pressure on Parliament in order to deal with it.
And it makes the process of creating the legislation all the more important in the two stages, because you rightly, and I think very importantly, point out that Parliament assents to legislation rather than creating it. And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about pre-legislative scrutiny. How practical do you think that is when governments are under pressure, have to deliver on manifestos and so on?
I think it's actually extremely important, both increasingly as well, both pre-legislative scrutiny and post-legislative scrutiny. And it does give a greater role for Parliament, because by looking at proposals for bills before they're ever formally introduced, Parliament can have a greater impact on government, because at that stage ministers are more willing to listen. Once a bill's being introduced, they're somewhat less willing to depart from what's been drawn up, agreed, that they like to see it through. So you're quite right in that it adds time to the process. But that's probably a price worth paying for good legislation. The danger is if you rush it through, it can be bad legislation and require amendment later on. If you get it right the first time round, less likelihood of that. So I think pre-legislative scrutiny can be valuable. It's enabling government to hear from others. I think pre-legislative scrutiny committees can perform a valuable role in linking up with outside organisations, feeding in material to government, which helps government. And I think the experience to date, certainly with a number of bills, has shown the value of that exercise, where government has accepted a large number of recommendations that have been made by the pre-legislative scrutiny committees.
And I think that's a really important point that you make, that governments ought to welcome scrutiny, because scrutiny actually helps the government do what it's aiming to do better. If it's got a majority, it will get the broad principle accepted, but a wise government will accept adjustments to the detail, because usually that is about improving the functionality of legislation rather than trying to stop legislation by secondary means.
Absolutely, and I think there's a key distinction there when a bill's going through between, say, second reading, which is approving the principle of a bill, and then actually addressing the detail. So members might agree with the principle, so they agree the ends of legislation, but they want to look at the means. Is this the best way of actually achieving what the government is seeking to achieve? So you're quite right, the government ought to welcome that if it seeks to improve the government's own legislation, and a confident government should have no concerns about that.
And how well do you think the two houses do their job of scrutinising the detail? I mean, I'll perhaps start with a thought of my own, which is that programming in the House of Commons at the committee stage has helped scrutiny enormously, because prior to programming, it was routine to be stuck on the first clause, to require guillotine, and then report back hardly having considered the bill at all. And that programming has had led to much more sophisticated engagement from MPs of both the governing party and of the opposition, and that therefore scrutiny has improved from a recent reform.
I think that's right. I mean, it depends where you're coming from, and you're quite right, compared with how it used to be, as you said, unless you had eventually a guillotine. And of course, there was a point at which the government decided, right, enough's enough. We've spent so long on clause 1, and it's an improvement. It could still be better. There's still the danger, of course, of the if you like, getting the programming wrong. And of course, within the Commons, you've still got the adversarial element. So quite often what happens in committee is you're focusing upon amendments that are favoured by the opposition. So there's still, if you like, the political element to it. So there's a difference between the two houses. I think the Lords is more concerned, if you like, with the actual detail, which can be quite practical and not raise great partisan issues. It's not an issue between the parties. So there's a difference between the two houses, but you can argue that makes for a complementary relationship between the two, because the Lords is doing it somewhat differently in a way that helps the Commons. So the Commons, if you like, plays to its strength. It is a political body necessarily. So the Lords is less so, and it's more involved in the detail. So it looks at it from a different perspective. But I think that's a wholly good thing, because the two houses are doing a good job, but in different ways.
One of the things I've noticed since I've been in Parliament, which I probably didn't realise when I was outside, is that a good and confident minister in the committee stage will actually listen very carefully to the arguments that are being made. And although the minister won't then stand up and say, oh yes, I think the opposition's got it right, when the bill gets to the House of Lords, it may well be there that an amendment is made that fits in with an argument that was won in the other house, and that's one of the good ways in which scrutiny takes place.
Oh yes, and I think I would add to that, it might be sooner, but you're quite right, because you can get what I'd regard as an informal stage between committee stage and report stage, where a minister has listened, might meet the members who've raised the concerns with a view to a government amendment at report. Now, that might not always be possible, so you're quite right. It may be held over, and the Lords is a very good vehicle for that. So there's further scrutiny, but it gives the government a chance, as well, having reflected on its own bill, to come forward with its own amendments when it reaches the Lords.
Actually, I was about to ask you about the informal mechanisms, because I think they're very little understood, and yet are remarkably important to the way legislation develops, both in the early stages when the legislation is still being debated within government, and then when they get to the two houses. Now, I wonder if you might like to try and explain a bit of that, in a way that I imagine most people don't understand or know about.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the focus tends to be on the formal stages because they're visible, and from point of view political science, they're measurable. But what it misses out is the use of what I tend to refer to as informal space within Parliament, away from committee rooms, away from the chamber, where members get together. Now, that can be ministers meeting with members to discuss measures that have been brought forward. So sometimes you will have informal meetings. Ministers will call a meeting, invite members with an interest in a bill to come and discuss it before the bill comes in. And I think that's extremely valuable. And once the bill's going through at committee stage, you hear the concerns of members, you get various amendments, probing amendments, the minister satisfies the member, or it raises an issue where the minister thinks, actually, yes, there's something there, and discusses it with a member with a view to the government itself bringing an amendment at a later stage. And that's wholly to the good. Members aren't necessarily wedded to their own amendments. They are not themselves necessarily trained in legislative drafting. So the minister may go back to Parliamentary Council and say, can you draft an amendment that meets this point in a way that's legally watertight? And that's, which I've had variously happen with various amendments. And I think that's absolutely to the fore. So it's that informal discussion, which is not visible. And so you don't always appreciate the influence that members are having, because all you see on the record usually are government amendments, which are the ones that dominate it, since are being passed, are the ones that dominate at report stage. So you think it's wholly executive driven, and it's not. It's actually a symbol of parliamentary influence that ministers are responding to what members have raised at earlier stages, and that happens in both houses. So by the time a bill's gone through, there might have been a lot of informal discussion between the minister, along with officials, the bill team, actually meeting with members to discuss issues.
And the government and Parliament is perhaps much more flexible than people see from the outside between the parties and the different interests, because actually everybody in the end wants good and workable legislation and aim towards that, even though they may want to apportion blame or credit in different directions.
Now, I think that's absolutely important, and I think that relates to another point, not just the informality, but the fact that Parliament's not a closed institution. So ministers not only hear from members, but through members, they're hearing from outside organisations that are affected by the legislation, which again is valuable for members in learning about some of the issues, being briefed on it, being able to question ministers about it. So I think that sort of engagement is wholly to the good in really engaging with all those who've got an interest in the subject. Members obviously have the opportunity to assess the worth of what they're hearing, decide whether it's worth pursuing with ministers. So I think it's that links with affected bodies outside, which could be individuals, organised groups. I think that's wholly to the fore. So there's a lot of discourse taking place as the bill is going through.
Yes, I mean, I very much agree with that. And it's actually one of the reasons, though this is a slight aside, that I thought it was so important to bring Parliament back physically, because it's much easier to get those communications from constituents, from interested groups to the minister if you're bumping into the minister at a safe social distance, rather than if you're sending it by email or a formal submission to a department, and that we were losing that for the period that we were in a hybrid Parliament. But I wanted to ask you about the speed with which Parliament acts, because very often the executive wants to do things quickly, and Parliament proceeds at a particular pace. Is this something you think is a problem in a democracy, that Parliament isn't necessarily very responsive, or do you think actually it's one of the great safeguards of minority rights?
The question of time, I think, is extraordinarily important, because it shows the importance of Parliament as an institution. Government can't get round it, it's got to go through Parliament, and there's limited time in each session necessarily for it to get its measures through. There's a limited amount of time, there are limited parliamentary resources, and of course it's a quite complex and rule-based system, so it constrains government. Government's got to prioritise its measures. What's valuable, what's most important, that does it want to bring forward? So there is a discipline, because of course for most bills they have to be got through within the session. That's quite, we are if not quite unique internationally, in having such a tight cut-off, the sessional cut-off. Some parliaments, you can have a bill on the agenda for the lifetime of the legislature, typically 4 years. Some legislatures, there's one in particular, it can stay on the agenda forever. So we're pretty unusual. There's just 1 or 2 parliaments where you have that sessional cut-off. There is now provision for carryover of certain bills, but that's limited. So we are disciplined in a way that others are not. So it puts it under pressure. So you've got to get the bill through within the session. So I think that's an important discipline. So we don't just let things run on and on. But at the same time, we're not rushing things through. Each house has to consider it. It's got to go through one house and then go to the other for different stages. So I think during the course of a session, you manage to get fairly detailed scrutiny. I don't think we should constrain it more for the reason you touched upon earlier, because the bills are getting longer and more complex. So to be fair, to ensure detailed scrutiny, you need a reasonable amount of time to achieve that.
Yes, and if there is consensus, on the other hand, you can legislate in an emergency. We managed to get rid of a king emperor in less than 24 hours, which was quite a major constitutional activity at the time.
And with a lot of bills, as you know, there is consensus between the parties. Quite often bills go through without being divided on second reading. So it's just a case of improving a bill, but it depends on the nature of the bill as to how long it needs.
Absolutely, and the relationship between the 2 houses, and obviously the Lords tending to do more of the detailed scrutiny and doing it all, or almost all, on the floor of the House rather than large amounts of it in a committee.
Yes, I mean, we increasingly make use of grand committee, so a bill can be away from the chamber for committee stage, but the principle, which you just touched upon there, is the important one. Any peer can attend grand committee. So anybody with an interest in the bill or a particular part of the bill can turn up for that particular part to offer their expertise. So it gives us a good degree of flexibility.
And I think that's one of the important things, that our procedures and conventions are there for a purpose, to allow both the Queen's government to be carried on, but also for proper scrutiny and protection of the rights of minorities. And that by and large, conventions or procedures that don't work and become obstructive get reformed in both houses. Not necessarily very quickly, but that both houses have evolved enormously to deal with the quantity of business that they have.
I think that's right. We've evolved, as you say. I mean, there are various rules, some embodied in standing orders, but others, it's just practice that you utilise for the reason you mentioned, to ensure some degree of balance. And so it's in the interests of both ministers and members, and indeed the relationship between government and opposition, to stick to those rules, because they're devised to be of benefit to both. The way I usually express it in terms of government and opposition is that it's designed to ensure the government can get its business, but the opposition is entitled to be heard. So I think that's an important relationship, and the practice facilitates that. I mean, the government could try and use its majority to constrict the opposition to change the rules, but it chooses not to do so because it recognises the legitimacy of the opposition being entitled to be heard and to make its case.
And I also think a wise government recognises that it won't necessarily be in office for an infinite amount of time. And when it's on the other side, it may want to be able to scrutinise rather more fully than it wishes to be scrutinised.
Absolutely, because we often refer to the opposition as the alternative government. I make the point that the government's also the alternative opposition. That is sometimes lost, but it's not always. I know it's back in the 80s, there was a recommendation to change the procedure, which would have limited the opposition, and the government opposed it. And underlying it was the fact the government recognised it was the alternative opposition. It didn't want to be in the future in a situation where if it was an opposition, it was constrained in the way that was proposed.
And how do you think, having looked at Parliament for a very distinguished career, I've got on my notes that when you were appointed in 1986, you were the youngest professor in politics in the UK. So an enormously distinguished period that you've been covering. You have brought your great distinction to the coverage of British politics. You probably know more about it than anybody else in the country. In that period, how do you think the reputation of Parliament has changed with the British people?
To some extent, it ebbs and flows because people quite often don't think of Parliament as Parliament, and they will assess their local MP separately from the institution. They distinguish between the two. So we tend to find that people regard the local MP, the constituency MP, in a fairly positive light, generally thinking the local MP is doing a good job rather than a bad job. That's different from the assessment of MPs generally and from the House of Commons. So they don't link one with the other. So with the local MP, I think there's a perception this is someone who's providing a service for the constituency. That's seen in a positive light. When they think of the House of Commons, they think either of two sides shouting at one another or empty green benches. So there's a problem there. And the standing, the trust in the institutions tend to ebb and flow, which is partly, well, I think quite largely influenced by, I'm afraid, perceptions of government. So if there's a feeling that the administration, the executive's doing well, that tends to have a knock-on effect, positive view of Parliament. If things are not going well in public policy, Parliament then doesn't get quite such a good response. So there's that. And then, of course, variously it may be knocked off course by individual level scandals and the danger of people generalising from an N of one. So there is a danger of that. So it's really Parliament, each house having to work hard, I think, establish its trust in the public and making the effort as well to hear from the public, as well as think about how does one communicate with the public. The Commons, both houses, doing a very good job in education resources, but there's another issue in demonstrating what one does politically wider to really bolster trust in what the institution is doing. So I think it's always going to be an uphill struggle, but it's a worthwhile exercise that both houses should be engaging in to explain to people what the institutions are doing, what it's delivering to them. So although I think people recognise one needs Parliament, you can't do without it, it's absolutely fundamental. Nonetheless, we can be doing more to enhance trust in the institution.
And it's very reassuring as a constituency MP, the thought that in each constituency the rating of the MP is higher than the institution as a whole. And of course, what we've been trying to do in this conversation is to explain what Parliament does and why not only is it essential, but it's actually quite useful. So thank you so much for your time. I could not be more grateful that you have been willing to share your expertise with us and I hope a wider audience. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you to Lord Norton for his thoughts and insights on the lawmaking process, as seen from a parliamentary perspective. But what about legislating from the perspective of a departmental minister taking a bill through? In the next episode, I will speak to a colleague who has not only shepherded legislation through the Commons, but is also responsible for ensuring all the nuts and bolts of our constitutional arrangements are just as they should be. Until then, goodbye for now.